March 1943. The North Atlantic in early spring. Gray water stretched in every direction beneath low clouds that pressed down like iron, and the wind carried the salt taste of cold spray across empty horizons. Beneath that surface, in the dark, cold depths where sunlight faded to nothing, German U-boats moved in coordinated groups, hunting the convoys that carried the lifeblood of Britain's survival. For 3 years, these submarines had dominated the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships faster than the Allies could replace them. But in the spring of 1943, something changed. U-boats that had prowled these waters with near impunity began disappearing at a rate that shocked even the most experienced commanders. The hunters had become the hunted, and the man inside those steel cylinders began to understand that the ocean they had once controlled was no longer theirs. The transformation did not announce itself with drama. There was no single decisive battle, no moment when the tide visibly turned. Instead, there was a gradual accumulation of losses, a steady attrition that crept through the U-boat fleet like water seeping through a weakened hull. Boats that left port in February and March simply failed to return. Radio transmissions ended mid-sentence. Position reports ceased. In the operations rooms of Befehlshaber der U-Boote, the U-boat command headquarters in Paris and later Berlin, the staff officers began moving fewer and fewer magnetic markers across their plotting tables. The empty spaces on those maps told a story that Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander of the U-boat arm, found increasingly difficult to accept. His submarines, the weapons he had promised would bring Britain to its knees, were dying in unprecedented numbers. To understand what happened in 1943, one must first understand what came before. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun in September 1939, within hours of Britain's declaration of war against Germany. U-boats operated under the doctrine that Dönitz had developed during the interwar years, a tactical approach built around coordinated wolfpack attacks against merchant convoys. The concept was methodical and ruthless. Rather than attacking alone, U-boats would gather in groups, shadow a convoy until nightfall, then strike simultaneously from multiple directions, overwhelming the escorts and creating chaos among the merchant ships. The tactic exploited several advantages. The submarines' low profile made them difficult to detect visually at night. Their diesel engines allowed them to chase convoys on the surface at speeds exceeding most escort vessels, and their commanders possessed aggressive training and iron discipline. Through 1940 and 1941, these wolf packs enjoyed what German submariners called the happy time. Allied convoys, inadequately protected and lacking effective detection equipment, suffered catastrophic losses. In the second half of 1940 alone, U-boats sank over 270 merchant ships, totaling more than 1.5 million tons. Individual commanders returned to their bases in occupied France as heroes, their conning towers painted with the silhouettes of ships destroyed, their crews receiving decorations and shore leave in ports where wine and music briefly replaced the smell of diesel oil and unwashed bodies. The men who served in U-boats developed a particular culture, one that blended technical expertise with a fatalistic acceptance of their profession's dangers. They knew the statistics. Submarine service was hazardous even when successful. But through 1941 and into 1942, the rewards seemed to justify the risks. They were winning. The convoy system, Britain's primary defense, struggled to counter the wolfpack tactic effectively. Escorts were too few and spread too thin. Detection equipment, primarily ASDIC, the British sonar system, proved nearly useless against submarines attacking on the surface at night. Air cover existed only within a few hundred miles of land, leaving a vast mid-Atlantic gap where submarines operated freely. The Royal Navy's escort vessels, many of them converted civilian ships or aging destroyers, lacked the speed to catch surfaced U-boats and the endurance to remain with convoys throughout their entire Atlantic crossing. Merchant ship losses climbed month after month. By late 1942, the situation had grown so dire that some British planners privately questioned whether the convoy system could be maintained. If the current rate of sinking continued, Britain's ability to wage war would collapse not from military defeat, but from simple starvation and industrial paralysis. German submarine crews in late 1942 expected this trend to continue. They understood their role in Germany's strategic framework. They could not invade Britain, but they could isolate it, cutting the Atlantic supply lines until resistance became impossible. The mathematics seemed straightforward. Britain required millions of tons of supplies annually, everything from food and fuel to ammunition and raw materials. If U-boats sank ships faster than American and British shipyards could replace them, the equation favored Germany. Dönitz continually pressed for more submarines, arguing that with 300 operational boats, he could guarantee victory in the Atlantic. He never received 300, but by early 1943, he commanded over 400 U-boats total, with typically 100 or more at sea simultaneously. The force appeared formidable, and the men who crewed these vessels had reason for confidence. They had survived the dangerous early patrols, learned their trade through experience, and witnessed firsthand how effective their tactics could be. What these men could not see, because it developed beyond their vision in shipyards and factories and research laboratories thousands of miles away, was the systematic construction of their defeat. The Allies had not accepted the U-boat threat passively. Throughout 1941 and 1942, while German submarines achieved their highest kill rates, American and British naval staffs, scientists, and industrial planners worked to close the gaps in Atlantic defenses. The response emerged across multiple dimensions simultaneously, a convergence of technology, tactics, industrial capacity, and intelligence that would transform the Battle of the Atlantic completely. The technological developments came first in small increments, then in an accelerating cascade. Radar, which had existed in primitive form since the late 1930s, underwent rapid refinement specifically for anti-submarine warfare. By 1943, escort vessels and aircraft carried centimetric radar operating on 10-centimeter wavelengths, equipment that could detect a submarine's conning tower at several miles distance, even in darkness or fog. This radar proved revolutionary because it negated the U-boat's primary tactical advantage, their ability to attack unseen on the surface at night. A surfaced submarine, once invisible in the darkness, now appeared as a distinct return on a radar screen. The U-boat crews possessed MATOX receivers that detected older metric wavelength radar, giving them warning to dive before aircraft arrived. But the new centimetric sets operated on frequencies the MATOX could not detect. German submarines in early 1943 found themselves surprised repeatedly by aircraft that appeared without warning, bombing attacks emerging from darkness that had previously meant safety. Air cover expanded dramatically. The mid-Atlantic gap, that vast space beyond the range of land-based aircraft, began to close as Allied air forces deployed very long-range aircraft specifically for anti-submarine patrol. American B-24 Liberators, modified to carry additional fuel tanks and depth charges, could reach 1,500 miles from their bases, covering areas that U-boats had considered safe refuges. British Coastal Command received Liberators as well, along with improved versions of existing patrol bombers. More critically, escort carriers entered service in numbers. These small aircraft carriers, many of them converted merchant ships, accompanied convoys directly, providing continuous air cover throughout the Atlantic crossing. A U-boat commander who surfaced to chase a convoy in mid-ocean might suddenly find aircraft overhead, an impossibility just months earlier. The psychological impact proved as significant as the tactical effect. The ocean, once a hiding place, had become transparent. Detection from the air brought with it weapons capable of killing. Depth charges underwent refinement with new explosive patterns and shallower settings designed to catch submarines before they could dive deep. The Allies introduced acoustic homing torpedoes, weapons that detected submarine propeller noise and guided themselves to the target. Forward-throwing weapons like Hedgehog, a mortar that launched patterns of contact-fused projectiles ahead of an escort vessel, allowed attacks without losing sonar contact. Each innovation multiplied the danger for U-boat crews. A submarine caught on the surface by radar-equipped aircraft had perhaps 30 seconds to dive before bombs or depth charges arrived. Even if the boat submerged successfully, the escort vessels overhead possessed weapons and tactics that made escape increasingly difficult. Intelligence operations contributed dimensions that remained invisible to German commanders. The Allied code-breaking effort, centered at Bletchley Park in Britain, had achieved intermittent success reading German naval enigma ciphers since 1941. By 1943, the intelligence flow became more consistent. Allied operational planners received decoded U-boat position reports, allowing them to route convoys around known submarine concentrations. The German Navy never realized their communications had been compromised. When convoys changed course unexpectedly, avoiding wolf packs positioned directly in their path, U-boat commanders attributed it to chance or perhaps radio direction finding. The systematic nature of these evasions went unrecognized. Dönitz continued to rely on radio communications to coordinate his submarines, unknowingly providing the Allies with precise information about his forces' dispositions. The industrial dimension overwhelmed every other factor. By 1943, American shipyards were completing merchant ships faster than U-boats could sink them. The Liberty Ship program, utilizing mass production techniques and welded construction, allowed completion of standard cargo vessels in weeks rather than months. American yards launched over 3,000 merchant ships during the war, the vast majority after 1942. This industrial capacity meant that even when U-boats achieved tactical success, sinking multiple ships from a convoy, the strategic impact diminished. The losses could be replaced. Equally important, American and Canadian shipyards produced escort vessels in vast numbers. Destroyer escorts, corvettes, frigates, all designed specifically for anti-submarine warfare. By spring 1943, convoy escorts no longer consisted of a handful of overworked destroyers, but of specialized hunter-killer groups with the training, equipment, and numbers to conduct sustained anti-submarine operations. The cumulative weight of these developments fell upon the U-boat fleet in March 1943. That month became the crisis point. German submarines concentrated against convoys SC-122 and HX-229, two formations that merged due to routing decisions and represented one of the largest convoys of the war. The wolf packs achieved significant success, sinking 21 merchant ships over 4 days of continuous action. Dönitz declared it a victory, but the cost proved higher than he acknowledged. Several U-boats sustained damage, and the convoy's escorts, reinforced by air cover once the ships entered range of Iceland-based aircraft, inflicted losses and prevented even greater destruction. More importantly, March marked the last month when U-boats would achieve such results without suffering disproportionate casualties in return. April 1943 brought the first clear indication of transformation. U-boat losses began to climb. Boats reported increasing difficulty approaching convoys undetected. Air attacks intensified. The radio messages received at U-boat command contained new notes of concern. Commanders described aircraft appearing without warning, depth charge attacks of unprecedented accuracy, and escort vessels that pursued contacts with determination that seemed to know precisely where submarines had gone. In April, the Kriegsmarine lost 15 U-boats in the Atlantic. This represented a notable increase over previous months, but the full extent of the crisis remained unclear. May 1943 destroyed any remaining illusions. That month, 41 U-boats were lost, a catastrophic casualty rate that exceeded crew training capacity and construction output. The losses occurred across the Atlantic, in the Bay of Biscay, even in transit areas that had been considered relatively safe. Dönitz, confronting losses he could not explain and could not sustain, made an unprecedented decision in the Battle of the Atlantic. On May 24th, he temporarily withdrew U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The submarines that had threatened Britain's lifeline for nearly 4 years retreated, conceding control of the sea to the forces hunting them. Inside the U-boats themselves, the men experienced this transformation through small details that accumulated into overwhelming certainty. The sound of aircraft engines became the sound they feared most. Where once submarines could surface at night to recharge batteries and transit at speed, now every moment on the surface carried risk. Lookouts scanned the sky continuously, and the alarm bell that sent men scrambling to diving stations rang with increasing frequency. The time available to dive shrank as radar-equipped aircraft learned to approach from the bearing where their target appeared smallest. Some boats took hits before they could submerge, bombs striking as the conning tower disappeared beneath the waves, the explosions rupturing pressure hulls and sending the submarine into an uncontrolled dive from which there was no return. Coffee became a recurring element in the testimony of survivors and the diaries of crew members, a small detail that represented something larger. U-boat crews lived on coffee, the hot, bitter liquid that fought exhaustion during long watches and provided brief comfort in the cold dampness that pervaded every submarine. But in 1943, as patrol durations extended and refit periods shortened, even coffee grew scarce. More significantly, the ritual of preparing coffee became increasingly difficult as submarines spent more time submerged, running on battery power, forbidden to surface where aircraft might catch them. The electric motors that powered underwater movement required complete silence to avoid detection, and crew members moved through the boat in near darkness, whispering when they spoke at all, while the hours stretched toward days. The coffee grew cold in their cups, and the cold coffee became a symbol of their situation. Something that had once provided comfort now only reminded them of what they had lost. The transformation affected different men differently. Some commanders, veterans of the happy time, who had grown accustomed to aggressive tactics and high kill counts, struggled to adapt to a defensive posture. They had been taught to hunt, and now found themselves the quarry. Others, younger officers on their first patrols, knew only this new reality where every surfacing might be their last. The letters they wrote home, when they wrote at all, reflected this shift. Where once they might have described successful attacks and the satisfaction of seeing a merchant ship sink, now they wrote about waiting, about silence, about the steady pressure of fear that accumulated during weeks at sea. Some became fatalistic, accepting that their survival depended more on chance than skill. Others grew cautious, perhaps too cautious, missing opportunities because hesitation seemed safer than action. The operational reports filed by returning commanders documented the change in clinical terms. Attacks broken off due to air cover, convoys located but not engaged because escort strength prevented approach, depth charge patterns of unusual accuracy, equipment failures attributed to prolonged submersion, battery capacity insufficient for extended evasion. These reports flowed into U-boat command throughout the spring and summer of 1943, and the staff officers who compiled them could not ignore the pattern. The methodical records that the German Navy maintained, the detailed accounting of operations and results that characterized their institutional culture, now documented their own defeat with the same precision they had once used to measure success. Dönitz attempted to respond. He pushed for new equipment, snorkels that would allow submarines to run diesel engines while submerged just below the surface, improved anti-aircraft armament, acoustic torpedoes that could target escort vessels. Some of these innovations arrived, but slowly, and none changed the fundamental equation. The industrial capacity that produced improved submarines and weapons existed in Germany, but it operated under growing constraints as Allied bombing intensified and resources became scarce. Meanwhile, Allied production continued to accelerate. The escort carriers entering service in mid-1943 represented merely the first wave of production. More followed continuously. The technological gap, rather than closing, widened. The human cost mounted in ways that statistics could not fully capture. U-boat crews in 1943 and beyond faced mortality rates that exceeded those of almost any other military branch in any nation. Roughly 75% of German submarine personnel who served during the war did not survive. They died in explosions, in slow suffocations as air ran out in damaged submarines, in the cold Atlantic water when their boats sank and they had no time to escape. Some submarines simply disappeared, their fate unknown, marked in the records only as missing, last reported at a certain position on a certain date. The families received telegrams that spoke of heroic sacrifice and service to the fatherland, words that could not describe the reality of death in a sinking submarine. Yet the men continued to serve. This requires acknowledgement because it speaks to something fundamental about human behavior under extreme conditions. U-boat crews knew the statistics. By late 1943, every submariner understood the odds he faced. They discussed it among themselves, with the dark humor that military personnel in all nations use to cope with mortality. But they still boarded the submarines, still cast off from the piers in Brest and La Rochelle and Bergen, still took their boats into the Atlantic, despite knowing that return grew increasingly unlikely. Some served from conviction, believing in the cause for which Germany fought. Others served from duty, because orders required it and military discipline demanded compliance. Many served simply because their comrades served, because the bonds formed in the close confines of a submarine created obligations that could not be abandoned. To understand what happened in 1943 requires acknowledging this complexity, that the men who died were not abstractions, but individuals who made choices within impossible circumstances. The Allied sailors and airmen who hunted U-boats experienced their own transformation. In 1940 and 1941, they had been the hunted, helpless to prevent the slaughter of merchant ships, forced to watch vessels burn and sink while unable to find or attack the submarines responsible. By 1943, they possessed the tools and tactics to fight effectively, and they fought with determination that reflected years of frustration and loss. The escort crews who prosecuted sonar contacts through hours of patient tracking, the aircraft crews who flew maritime patrol missions through weather that grounded everything but anti-submarine aircraft, the convoy commodores who maneuvered merchant ships with a precision that defied their vessels' unwieldy nature, all contributed to a system that, by mid-1943, had achieved clear superiority. The acoustic signature of diesel engines became another recurring element in this story. U-boats ran on diesel power when surfaced, and the distinctive sound of their engines carried for miles across calm water. Allied hydrophone operators learned to identify this sound, distinguishing it from merchant ships, fishing vessels, or natural ocean noise. In 1940, hearing a U-boat's engines meant little because escorts lacked the speed and weapons to respond effectively. By 1943, that sound triggered immediate response, escorts racing toward the bearing, aircraft vectored to the location, the submarine forced to dive and begin the exhausting evasion that might last hours. Some U-boats fell victim to their own engines, the machinery that had once given them mobility and endurance, now advertising their presence to every listening hydrophone within range. The sound that represented power and freedom became the sound that preceded death. The withdrawal from the North Atlantic in May 1943 did not end U-boat operations. Donetsk shifted submarines to other areas, the South Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, the Caribbean. Some operated in distant waters where Allied defenses remained weaker, achieving occasional successes that provided propaganda value if not strategic impact. Others received new equipment and returned to the North Atlantic in the autumn, attempting to resume the battle with improved weapons and revised tactics. These renewed operations never achieved the success of earlier years. The loss rates remained high, sometimes catastrophically so, while the tonnage sunk decreased steadily. The Battle of the Atlantic continued until Germany's surrender in May 1945, but after May 1943, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The statistical record tells the story with cold clarity. In 1942, U-boats sank over 6 million tons of Allied shipping in the Atlantic. In 1943, despite having more submarines operational than any previous year, they sank just over 2 million tons, while losing 237 U-boats. In 1944, tonnage sunk fell to under 800,000 tons, while losses climbed to 240 boats. The mathematics that Donetsk had once claimed favored Germany now worked entirely in the Allies' favor. Every U-boat lost represented trained crew members who could not be easily replaced, industrial resources consumed in construction, and tactical knowledge removed from the force. Every merchant ship sunk could be replaced within weeks by American shipyards. The men who survived U-boat service carried the experience throughout their lives. Some spoke about it, participating in historical research or writing memoirs. Others remained silent, unable or unwilling to revisit memories of cold steel hulls and deep water. The survivors' accounts, when examined collectively, reveal a consistent pattern. They describe 1943 as the year when everything changed, when the confidence and aggressive spirit of earlier years gave way to defensive caution and mounting losses. They remember specific details: the smell of diesel oil mixed with unwashed bodies, the condensation that dripped constantly from the boat's interior surfaces, the sound of depth charges exploding at varying distances, the particular quality of silence that meant aircraft overhead. And many remember the coffee, or the lack of it, that small deprivation that somehow represented all the larger losses. The transformation that occurred in 1943 demonstrated several truths about modern warfare. It showed that industrial capacity could matter more than individual courage or tactical skill. The German submarine force possessed experienced commanders, well-designed boats, and effective tactics, yet lost because it faced an enemy who could produce ships, aircraft, weapons, and trained personnel faster than they could be destroyed. It demonstrated that technology could shift operational balance decisively when applied systematically across multiple domains simultaneously. No single innovation defeated the U-boats, rather a constellation of technologies: radar, aircraft, sonar, depth charges, code breaking, industrial production, combined to create conditions that submarines could not survive. It revealed the limitations of attempting to strangle an enemy's economy through commerce raiding when that enemy possessed both the industrial means to replace losses and the determination to sustain the fight. Britain never came as close to starvation or industrial collapse as German planners hoped, partly because American production filled the gaps, partly because the convoy system proved more resilient than expected, and partly because the U-boat force could not sustain the kill rates necessary to achieve strategic success. The submarine remained a potent weapon, capable of inflicting severe damage, but it could not win the war Germany needed it to win. The epilogue to the U-boat story unfolded in the years after May 1943 as a slow, grinding attrition that confirmed the conclusions visible that spring. Submarines continued to sail, crews continued to die, and the Atlantic remained contested until the war's final days. But the initiative had passed permanently to the Allies, and with it went any possibility that Germany could isolate Britain or prevent the buildup of forces in England that would eventually invade France. The U-boats, once Germany's most effective strategic weapon, became instead a tragic example of courage expended in a losing cause, of men sent to fight battles that industrial mathematics had already decided. In the spring of 1943, in the cold, gray waters of the North Atlantic, something fundamental shifted in the balance of naval warfare. The submarines that had prowled those seas so effectively found themselves hunted by forces they could not overcome. The men who served in those steel cylinders discovered that the ocean had become a trap rather than a refuge, that every day at sea brought them closer to a death they could not avoid through skill or courage alone. They fought on because military service demands it, because comrades depend on each other, because surrender felt impossible even when victory had become unattainable. Their story deserves telling not as celebration of their defeat, but as acknowledgement of what happens when human beings find themselves caught in historical forces beyond their control, when the coffee grows cold in the darkness, when the sound of engines overhead becomes the last sound they hear, when the mathematics of industrial war renders individual sacrifice strategically meaningless, yet personally absolute. The U-boats that disappeared in 1943 carried men who believed they served something larger than themselves, and they took that belief with them into the cold depths where belief and doubt alike become irrelevant, where only the historical record remains to mark their passing.